We are going to move on to this first panel session of the day, delivering space strategy together. And so we're going to really delve into, do a deep dive, as the Air Marshal was saying, into really how the private sector should engage to support national space strategy. So over the next hour, we are going to look at cross-government relationships and the responsibilities of departments, think tanks and other organisations, and get future perspectives on the government plan. So please do, first of all, welcome Doug Liddell, who's the CEO and founder of InSpace, which has launched 2 satellites and has several more in stages of design and build. And previously, he was at Surrey Satellites, and before that, at the Defence Research Agency. So welcome to you, Doug. Lovely. If you want to take a seat.
I'll take a seat first. I'll do the...
Just to start off with. And next, please do welcome Group Captain David Keeley, who's Assistant Head Space Policy at the MOD. And during his 33-year career at the Royal Air Force, he's amassed over 20 years of space experience in areas like ballistic missile early warning, space domain awareness, space tactics and training, and space policy and strategy. So hugely qualified to be here with us today. Also, a welcome to the panel, Joshua Broome. He is Head of Space at the UK Department for Business and Trade. And Joshua leads the department's space engagement with UK companies looking to export to global markets. Welcome, Joshua. Lovely to have you with us. Thank you. Also welcome Juliana Zeus, who is the research analyst and policy lead on space security as part of the military sciences team at RUSI. Welcome, Julia. Julia is also the host of the podcast War in Space, an excellent listen, so please do take a seat. And last but certainly not least, Mark Bacon, Deputy Director of Space at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Mark leads the strategy for delivering the national space capabilities referred to in the National Space Strategy. Welcome. So, to kick off this panel, and this is a similar format that we'll have for the other panels of the day, we're going to get a short kind of impulse statement and presentation from the lead panelist, which is Doug Liddell. So Doug, please do take it away and provoke some of our thoughts to kick off our discussion.
Thank you very much, Susanna. I'll try not to be too provocative, but unfortunately, I can't probably help myself. So, delivering the space strategy together. And actually, the important thing here, in my mind, is that we're not talking about looking to government and saying, come on, crack on, build a strategy, and we're ready to follow. It's about us working together. We've got a lot of the really strong technical capabilities currently in the industrial sector, in academia, and we need to be working with government, not waiting for government. I thought I'd start with the view from below. So looking at the defence enterprise, sort of encompassing everything that's happening in the UK around defence. So I've got just coming up on 30 years in the sector. As Susanna mentioned, I was at DRA, Surrey Satellites, and started my own company in 2015. Starting and growing a company is absolutely not for the faint-hearted. I can see some people out there that, similar to me, look about 30 years older than their biological age. And it takes a lot out of you. And after a few years of pivoting and repivoting, or as a friend of mine said, you know, in England, dear boy, we call it changing our minds. We started developing multi-use platforms for hosted payloads to look at tech demonstrations and low-cost access to space. And this took us down the line of developing software-defined satellites. In those early days, MOD, in the shape of DSTL, actually provided really strong engagement with us, and they were highly supportive of what we were doing. However, getting on contract, that was the fun. And it's a challenge, and it still is for the smaller companies and the larger companies. You know, either directly accepting the DEFCONs or being onboarded by a larger organisation who's priming whatever it is you're doing, web view as a lower tier subco, is really hard. It takes a lot of resource, and it's really difficult as a small company to access this. Despite this, at InSpace, we persevered, and we were eventually onboarded by several primes, including BAE and Airbus, and the Serapis Lot 2 framework. And we also, along the way, secured 2 capability demonstration missions in Prometheus 2 with Airbus and Titania. Now, the quandary I have here is, there's every part of me that wants to pull the ladders up behind me and say, well, we managed it, why can't you? However, by making it so hard, I think MOD really misses out on a lot of really capable SMEs who could bring some game-changing innovation to the sector. My request would be to MOD, keep creating programs and streamlining the T's and C's that allow you to access the SME capabilities. And industry, we've got to keep working to make it easier to bring those SME capabilities into the fold as part of our solution, particularly the big primes. Now, ultimately, in 2021, as we grew our software-defined satellite capability and we started to develop the tech around software-defined clusters, we approached BAE looking for investment. We had a tremendous meeting of minds as we realised that our vision was very similar to their vision and the stuff they'd been developing internally. And not long afterwards, we were acquired. And in September 2021, we became part of the BAE Systems group. So what was exciting about joining BAE Systems was how far-reaching the vision is. It wasn't a few million to build a CubeSat demo, it was tens of millions to develop, build and launch and operate the first generation cluster of multi-sensor satellites in this newly named Azalea system. There were substantial internal R&D investments that followed, developing space sector specific secure comms, SDRs and on-edge machine learning, leveraging where BAE already had domain leading capabilities in these areas for terrestrial applications. There's been external investment too, as well as the acquisition of InSpace. BAE invested in ISI and is incorporating their novel agile SAR capabilities into the Azalea system. Simply put, the Azalea system will deliver a reconfigurable, resilient space ISR capability across RF, SAR and optical and provide machine learning both on ground and on edge in orbit to securely put assured intelligence in the hands of the soldier in the field or the decision maker in the office at the speed of relevance. The scale of this investment, having done the sales pitch for it, it's so wonderful, but the scale of this investment is reflected in an ongoing ramp up in how to deliver change to the UK defence enterprise. Focused internal investment by industry in light of uncertain and evolving customer requirements is creating a stimulus for models of engagement between industry and government, where a range of partnership models will deliver much more value and capability than traditional procurement. This is industry and government working hand in hand. So, final slide. So, don't worry, there will be conversation soon. Looking at how you leverage the investment, we want to see ongoing supply chain growth in the UK. We want to see that resilience and capability growth that the UK is already starting to stimulate inside industry. Wherever possible, we need to be folding innovation into the supply chain, encouraging primes and government to seek to continue to simplify onboarding and contractual conditions to encourage SMEs, many of whom have received large amounts of private investment into the sector. Growing UK capabilities and providing the UK with freedom of action will enable the UK to meet its sovereign needs and collaborate and share from a position of strength. Indigenous capabilities procured by UK government also create strong export potential for UK PLC. In addition, the vast majority of space capabilities are inherently dual use in function. We need to make them dual use by design to ensure we can address the UK's civil requirements alongside its defence needs. We also need to increase the speed of adoption of assured space, ISR, EO data in the UK. As a species, mankind is facing urgent questions around climate change. As a country, the UK has a pressing need to better understand its adversaries, control its own borders and waters, and monitor its critical national infrastructure. Space provides the global reach and resilience to do this. In fact, I would posit that only space provides that global reach and resilience. And finally, as mentioned, the operational capabilities to be delivered from space are no longer things to be done in 10 or 20 years. We need many of these capabilities now, like yesterday, if we are to adequately address the pressing needs facing us. As such, we need government to join with industry. We invite you to let us work alongside you to understand the problems, develop the solutions, and start accessing extant capabilities, with the ultimate goal of moving with urgency and pace beyond demonstration and into operation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to put some of your points to the other panelists in a moment, but first I want to get a bit of an overview from the defence side. So Dave, let's focus a little bit on the threats and considerations the UK needs to address and what types of initiatives are really underway to address these.
Yeah, thanks, Susanna. Always good to start a panel discussion talking about the things that should be keeping us all awake at night. So lots of familiar faces in the audience, and you've probably heard us talk about something called the counter-space continuum before, and it's just a way that we use to describe the sliding scale of space threats that are out there. So this can be everything from electronic warfare systems that can create jamming effects through to lasers, cyber attacks, directed energy weapons, hostile satellites on orbit, anti-satellite missiles, all the way up to very extreme options such as high-altitude nuclear explosions. And if that's not enough to worry about, then space systems are also vulnerable to a range of more kind of traditional threats as we describe them. So that could be physical attacks on ground infrastructure or on key personnel. It could be espionage or supply chain disruption. And when you talk to audiences outside the space community, they think these are things for the future, but these are threats that are around today. Just as examples, the Air Vice Marshal mentioned the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Since that invasion, so since February 22, Russia has conducted widespread satellite communications jamming over Eastern Europe, including of commercial systems such as Viasat and Starlink. It's conducted GPS jamming in the Kaliningrad Oblast, which has created issues for civilian air traffic in the Baltic region. It's taken possession of 36 UK-owned OneWeb satellites that were due for launch from Baikonur. I think I saw Chris Moore at the back a second ago. It's conducted cyber attacks against ground infrastructure targets as well, and also conducted multiple suspicious satellite maneuvers very, very close to other nations' satellites. And they've even stated in the UN that they reserve the right to openly target what they describe as quasi-civilian infrastructure, i.e. commercial targets. And that's just Russia. And we shouldn't forget that China has probably got an even more potent counter-space arsenal. So the threats are very real. The threats are today, and they affect the entire space ecosystem. So what are we doing about them then? Let's start with kind of the very top level responses. So MOD currently is working with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office on shaping international narratives around responsible space behaviors. So that's trying to get everyone to understand what a bad action looks like in space, so we can call it out and understand and respond. We're also significantly enhancing our space domain awareness to improve our ability to detect, attribute, and respond to threats. So you might have heard recently in the press about us partnering with the US and Australia to deliver a ground-based network of deep space surveillance radars to improve our tracking of the GEO belt. Space Command and UK Space Agency have recently partnered on a camera telescope as well, also looking out into GEO. And we're trying to improve our data analysis functions within our UK Space Operations Centre, as well as evolving it eventually into a national space operations centre that will then bring together military, civil, and industry partners to assure our space security. Then we move on to things like trying to make our systems more resilient. So obviously we are developing now the next generation of secure, highly resilient satellite communications to replace our Skynet fleet. And we're also looking at options to enhance the resilience of our positioning, navigation, and timing networks. One of the other areas which can be seen as a little bit controversial, but it's something that we need, is we're developing the ability to do our own space control effects. So giving us the ability to be able to punch back and respond in the space domain, but also across other domains. So space control doesn't have to be something that only occurs in space. And of course, would be applying those effects in a manner consistent with international law and norms of responsible behavior. And then also working with academic partners to try and close that skills gap that the commander mentioned earlier in terms of building a space academy that will bring in cross-government partners, industry and academia to try and close that gap and so we can try and develop that workforce for the future. So a key takeaway, I guess, is that there are sector-wide threats out there that require sector-wide responses. Doug has alluded to this in terms of we need academia to help us horizon scan, understand the context, and stimulate informed debate. We need a thriving scientific community that can allow us to explore the application of new technologies, but also bring in existing technologies into the space sector from other sectors, an industry that can bring those technologies to life to meet government requirements. And of course, we need government cohesion where our interests align. Easy to say, a lot harder to do, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. And you mentioned there academics who are horizon scanning. Let me bring in Juliana now. And obviously, Dave talked about the current threats that we're facing right now. You've been looking at future threats as well, haven't you? And what's your take on that?
Yeah, so Dave, sorry, it's the last conference of the year, so I've already lost my voice. Dave's already talked about what's keeping us awake at the moment, so I'm going to try to horizon scan what's going to keep us up for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I think in the short to medium term, we are going to see a continuation of the threats that we're already seeing, so sub-threshold activity, primarily in the non-kinetic domain. So we're talking about cyber, electromagnetic, non-kinetic physical, so laser dazzling, for example. And I think that will continue, for example, especially if we're looking at what the Russian doctrine says on this. Russia is very well aware that its space capabilities are not on par with the West, but it actually also sees that the US dependence on space as a vulnerability. And it's going to try to use asymmetric advantage to disrupt, potentially destroy these space capabilities when it can. The potential for kinetic attacks, where I see it, is in the realm of miscalculation. That's where I see the danger of potential kinetic fallout. I think also the development of less destructive weapons, whether they be kinetic or non-kinetic, may see a sort of lower threshold in conducting these kind of maneuvers. And we already talked about the close maneuvers that Russia is conducting. We've also seen China do quite a range of these, specifically also in geostationary orbit. So that should definitely worry us, which I think in turn could then again increase the risk of miscalculation. We can't see exactly what's happening. Specifically, when talking about geostationary orbits, I think that's where it gets really dangerous. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Juliana. I'll get more from you in a moment. Mark, let me bring you in. We talked there about current and future threats. Let's talk about it from the government perspective. I mean, how many government departments work on space at the moment, and what initiatives are underway?
There's more than you think, which, before everybody's hearts sink, is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a sign of success. So if you look back at space some years ago, we had the UK Space Agency, we obviously had activity inside defence, on Skynet, we had research activities, but there wasn't that presence in the central government departments that you have now. And that's partly because of the nature of space. What is space? Is it just a technology? Is it an enabling function? Is it an actual place? There are so many different aspects to space that it's not surprising it hits a number of different departments. But the fact that it's now recognised as being important to have in those departments at senior levels is a big sign of how far we've come and the maturity with which we think about space. It shows that we're starting to take it seriously. We're discussing it at the right levels. So if I give you a quick rundown, we've now got something called the National Space Council, which is where the Secretaries of State for a number of departments come together to talk about space matters. That's really interesting because it puts it on their agenda. They have to come and discuss the different space issues that the different departments raise. So it's a really effective forum to have the conversations and raise awareness at that senior level in government around what we need to do in space. In terms of what the different departments are and what they're involved with, my own department, Science, Innovation and Technology, quite new, but we sponsor the UK Space Agency. We've got spectrum policy within the department, the PNT office, so looking at defence time, they're within the department as well, and also the research community. So we do a lot of R&D money with academia and the research sector. Josh's department's got a key role in supporting space as a trade or a commercial sector. So bringing in companies into the UK, helping UK companies export. We would like the space sector to use those mechanisms a lot more. They don't always need to go to the UK Space Agency for everything. They can use all the other mechanisms across government. You've obviously got MOD. MOD's got a key interest in this, and Space Command is a huge step forward in terms of the capability within defence. FCDO works on those global norms, the UN processes, trying to set the standards for behaviour in space. There are a few other ones that you might not expect. Department for Transport runs the licensing. So if you want to launch something from the UK, then Department of Transport would do the licensing for you. And Cabinet Office. So Cabinet Office does the National Risk Register. So a lot of the threats that we just talked about are starting to appear on the national set of risks. Every time they're refreshed, more and more space risks go on there. So I would expect the next review, which will be 2024, to include even more. But that process is just underway.
Is there enough signposting, do you think? for those companies who want to get a foothold and want to be heard to know where to go to, given there are so many departments involved?
I think it's fairly clear what they do. We've tried to set it out in the National Space Strategy, but I can imagine it's confusing. If you're a small company, you may not understand where to go to. So the Space Agency has got a front door service where it's trying to direct people towards the right parts of government if you're interested in getting some R&D support. It is confusing, but I think it's partly the nature of space, and I think the responsibilities are fairly clear. But if people are not clear, let us know.
Well, let me bring in Josh, because I think he could provide some clarity as well. So from the Department for Business and Trade's perspective, how do you see both the industrial base, defence, and the government really working together? What interventions are needed, particularly when it comes to the export policy side? And perhaps you could respond as well to Doug's point that he really feels as though SMEs need a bigger voice at the table.
Yeah, so I think the industrial capability is what really binds all of these departments together. We can't deliver national space capabilities, defence capabilities without the industry, without companies like In Space Missions or any of the many companies that are in this room. It's what unites the civil side, the defence side, our objectives that sit under the National Space Strategy that align to the Defence Space Strategy. We've got initiatives like the Space Partnership, which brings together the government, industry, the academic side of things as well, to agree our shared objectives as to how we deliver on the National Space Strategy. I think as the sector continues to grow, and it has had really strong growth over the last decade or so, we do need to continue increasing the priority of space. As Mark says, the number of departments now doing space is a reflection of the priority. Only a couple of years ago, the Space Directorate in DCIT, previously Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and my department didn't have dedicated space teams. Now we do, because we recognise that there are more levers that we should be pulling in order to grow the industry, in order to bring SMEs to the table. My department, for example, has a number of initiatives that specifically target SMEs in training them up in how to export, in how to access international finance or domestic finance. And we know that there are increasingly more ways that the SME voice is brought to the table in trade associations and in forums that, for example, the new science minister is now running out of the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, as well as in my department. We have forums that my department also runs, specifically looking at how to increase the number of SMEs that have a voice, have operational capabilities and not just shiny things that on the shelf. And so, but we do need to go further, and we've heard a lot about resilience, for example, and supply chain resilience. That is a key focus for my department in particular. That economic security is specifically tied to our economic growth in what is an increasingly contested and complex geopolitical situation globally. Economic growth and economic security go hand in hand. In a sector like space, where it is inherently dual use, that it is absolutely critical that when we're thinking about where we're exporting, where we're inviting investment from, that we are thinking about that threat landscape and those geopolitical complexities that we have to navigate. And so we are evolving our export policy. We are evolving our investment strategy to make sure that we are partnering with the right people, that the industry know where is a suitable place for their space technology and their space services to be exported to, and for where investment should be sought from, whether that's domestically or internationally. There are routes that we are now exploring to increase that economic security, that resilience within the sector, but at the same time continue to grow it in what is an increasingly complex landscape.
Yeah, it certainly is a complex landscape. And let me bring back Doug. Obviously, we've talked about the many threats and challenges ahead. There are way more challenges, not least climate change, for example, where actually space will play a critical role. How do you think that the private sector can really be best utilised, and what extra support do you need?
I think it's the thing that's been touched on by several of the panel. It's this idea that the government should start federating its needs. It should have a transversal roles in government that can say, actually, look, these are the capabilities out there. We can buy those capabilities. In fact, we get together, we get more buying power because we all need sort of the same stuff. And industry working with government to try and get those messages across is important, because it's not just about adding capability, it's also about reducing costs to government. And I think we sometimes get lost in this idea of space being exotic and expensive. Actually, it isn't. When you compare it, replacing some of the activities we do from space with people. Actually, space is a great way of automating a whole bunch of stuff that we currently spend a lot of time and money doing. I think, the other thing there is that by federating those capabilities, it allows industry to have a clearer horizon to invest against. Because at the moment, it's quite challenging. And I think I mentioned it earlier, in light of fairly uncertain national requirements. Now, as somebody in industry, I pick up my newspaper or digitally look at my newspaper, and I'm very aware of the things that are out there, that what's going on, what's urgent, and where space could address that. We don't always get that feel coming back from government. So this is part of the sort of narrative where industry gets a little bit lost and says, but hang on, we're building these, you need these now. And government says, yes, and in 10 years' time, we'll be buying them. But after some studying and approving and doing some business case reviews. And it's stuff like that. I think we can get a bit disjointed. So I think getting that message of urgency and also the benefits of space, not just in capability, it's not exotic, it's not expensive, it's a real thing that we can actually deliver now, and government could go out and buy a lot of the capabilities they need tomorrow, in fact.
Okay, well, I'm going to take that thought and put it back to Mark. Obviously, you've got to weigh up delivering for what's needed now to what the need will be in, say, 5 to 10 years' time for national space capabilities. How do you make that? How do you weigh that up? How do you try and attain some balance?
I'm not sure it's a question of weighing it up so much as the problem of government procurement. So it's taxpayers' money, and there are all sorts of rules in place that make it difficult to procure things, particularly buying things in advance of them actually being there. So for government to contract for a service that doesn't yet exist because the spacecraft are not in orbit is quite a tricky problem for our commercial colleagues to work through. I think the good news is that there's a recognition that we're not doing enough on capabilities and we're not doing it quickly enough. So one of the main challenges we get from the national space strategy from the sector is that we've got a huge range of ambitions, and actually it's not very clear which things we're going to move on first. So we've had the sector challenge us on that quite a lot, and we're going to try and address that early next year by setting out which capabilities we're really going to focus on in the short term. So that we're almost trying to do all the capabilities at the same time, and they're advancing, and there's a lot of activity going on in the defence side. There are a number of programmes that are delivering the capabilities we need. But on the civil side, we're doing a lot of R&D across a number of areas, and they're not necessarily as well coordinated or directed. So the idea is that next year we would issue the space sector plan that would set out 5 or 6 areas where we're really going to try and have a national ambition for capabilities and try and coordinate all the different levers we've got across government to actually accelerate or increase the ambition, or actually do it in a genuinely dual-use way, because dual use is quite tricky. Almost everything in space is dual use, but to actually make it genuinely dual use, it's really difficult, because you've got to have people around the table at the start having very difficult questions and conversations around what you want to achieve. A colleague uses the analogy of it's really nice and easy to give somebody a lift to the airport if you're already going to the airport, but if you had no intention of going to the airport, that's when it actually becomes meaningful, because that's when you've adapted your behaviour and you've tried to deliver what they want. So having those conversations up front around what does the civil side need and the defence side, and then building it and designing it, that's proper dual use. And that's where we need to get to. But at the moment, we're not quite there, I would say.
Well, actually, that was one of the questions that's come through on Slido, just how do you improve the kind of procurement process? Josh, how can we really improve the prospects and access for the UK space sector in particular?
So I think Mark's touched on it already, but fundamentally, we are already starting, but we need to go much further and quicker in joining together the investments, the exports, the programme delivery, the policy developments, and the procurement agendas across civil and military. Now, as I say, we're already starting to do that. For example, my department does support both civil and defence exports and civil and defence investment, which means we are speaking to the Ministry of Defence on a regular basis about how investment into the UK space sector can serve not just civil purposes, whether that's for commercial opportunities or civil requirements that will start coming through in the government side, but also the military side as well. And so, and vice versa, we've worked hand in glove with the Ministry of Defence on procurement recently to ensure that procurement that is run through the MOD does help grow the sector and make it more resilient, not just from a national security perspective to deliver the defence requirements that they have, but also that wider economic agenda of economic security and resilience within the supply chain. So we're already starting to do that, but we do need to do more of it. So one area that we're increasingly trying to work with the Ministry of Defence and UK Space Command and MOD Space Policy Team have been great at embracing this, is on the exportability of UK space capabilities. So we know, for example, that Skynet is a program that we collaborate with international partners and allies on already. There are multiple countries that are already using Skynet. Technically, it's an export, so I'll put a big tick in my box for that. But that's the kind of thing that where we have future programs in the defence space portfolio, that we're now having a discussion with the Ministry of Defence and with DSTL, for example, on where their procurement strategies and their procurement approaches will not just lead to delivering a capability they need for their defence requirements, but also help the sector grow, help bring more SMEs into the supply chain, help attract investment into those companies, and potentially, eventually become an export that the UK can genuinely say, we have put not just civil and military effort into this, but we are now a genuine world leader in this capability. We can sell it around the world, because ultimately, at the moment, if you take out the direct-to-home TV, slightly distorting figures in our revenue generation in the sector, the majority of our income comes from exports. That demand domestically is there, but it is not where the space sector is getting the majority of its revenue. That's globally. We are seeking those opportunities, those contracts, that collaboration with international partners to make money. Obviously, I support that, but we want to, and we are already starting to work more broadly across the UK government to do that together, to grow the sector together through both support mechanisms that my department has, that DSIT has, the Space Agency has, but increasingly the Ministry of Defence. So it is starting to happen. Those discussions are already happening across government, but we recognise we do need to go further and faster.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Josh. There will be sure to be some more questions about this coming through, but I've got a couple more that I want to put to the panel. Now, we talked about the current threats and future threats, Juliana, but your research also looks at adversaries' action in the space domain. What can we learn from them?
Yes, absolutely. Now, I just want to clarify who I'm talking about here, because I think it's quite important. Definitely not talk about Russia, because if you want to learn how to be the first space power, but also potentially the first one out, look no further. I think someone that we have been watching in this space is China, because we've seen very continuous development, continuous thinking and investment into space. And it was actually Blythen Bowen who said to me, what we're seeing now in terms of what China's doing in space, that's all plans from the 90s that are being fulfilled now. So if we're talking long-term thinking, that's really what we've seen from China. I think that all that being said, I do think that there's still agility and flexibility in that system, because we have seen China really prioritize some of its investments, specifically in the LEO space, where they've started, they've clearly seen the success of Starlink, but also OneWeb, and decided we also need a LEO constellation that can do this, which is why they've built up a program called Guowang, which will basically mean that a lot of its sort of current LEO constellations will be built together to form one consistent one. I think where both Russia and China are losing out, though, where I think our strength lies, is a sort of innovation that comes from the private sector. Neither Russia nor China have invested much in this or paid any particular attention to this. Specifically, Russia, I think if we look at their actions over the last 30 years, even when the Soviet Union fell and sort of private sector could even open up, there was not really any real sort of motivation to actually open up and have a private sector. They very much wanted space to remain under central control of the government. And even though China has sort of tried to unlock some private sector growth, specifically with Document 60 in 2019, this is still sort of slow going. And I think we're going to be able to, really monitor this over the coming years. Apologies. I think something else, and that's my sort of second point, long-term thinking, but also this is something that Josh mentioned, and that's the export of infrastructures. Digital Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, China has been really good at sort of investing, but also engaging with, for example, Africa. More than 70% of 4G infrastructures in Africa are Huawei built, which I think is a shocking figure when I read it for the first time. But I think it also gives us a sort of overview of what the next 10 or 20 years might look like when these infrastructures are built upon, because it might just be easier to plug into further Chinese infrastructures, given that the sort of basis is already there. So I think the export of infrastructures, the sort of space cooperation, I know that we're very good at forming alliances with our existing partners through structures such as CISPO, et cetera. But I do think we sometimes struggle to look a little bit further. So I think the export of infrastructures is a sort of second thing I would argue that we can learn, of the limited things that we can learn from.
Okay, Julia, thank you very much. And talking about forming alliances, Dave, can you talk a little bit more about the UK's relationship with allies in respect of the space realm?
Sure, yeah. I think it's been clear from what's been discussed just here that we can't do it alone. The UK can't solve international geopolitical global issues when it comes to the space domain. And obviously working with allies and partners is critical to that. I like to think that the UK does have a long and distinguished history of working with allies and partners in space. Recent example of that would be, for example, Royal Air Force Fylingdales. So you may have seen in the press that it recently celebrated 6 decades of combined operations as a joint enterprise of the UK and US governments. Similarly, we've had SATCOM sharing agreements in place with NATO for many, many decades. But on the NATO point, we've been supporting their more recent efforts to try and operationalize the space domain. So we've been embedding UK personnel within the NATO Space Centre at Ramstein, and we're soon to have someone joining the newly established Centre of Excellence in Toulouse. We've influenced their NATO capstone warfighting concept, and we're now helping them to develop their core NATO space doctrine revision. And we've configured our UK Space Force elements to enable us to better support NATO operations. And also working closely with FCDO again, we've also influenced top-level NATO exercises where they're now starting to play out space and cyber issues at that kind of grand strategic level as they try and reflect on NATO's deterrence and defence requirements. But NATO, of course, isn't the only multilateral forum we've been part of. You've mentioned CISPO, Air Vice Marshal Godfrey mentioned CISPO as well. I was actually involved in the initial stages of CISPO when it set up in 2011, so it's great to see, in those days, 4 nations now turning into 10 nations. We've also been part of Operation Olympic Defender, which is a US-led operation to strengthen our deterrence against hostile space actors and to be able to respond collectively to some of those threats that we've been hearing about this morning. And that's another example of kind of operational federation, and Doug touched on the concept of federation. But to Juliana's point about it's not just about these multilateral relationships, it's also about the bilateral ones. And one of the things we're finding right now is everyone wants to come and speak to us. So it's quite tricky because it's outstripping our capacity to talk to everyone. So we're having to prioritize quite carefully how we do it, but without shutting any doors, because you never know what that one nation might bring to the party when it comes to capabilities, knowledge, and those sorts of things. I guess the key takeaway is allies and partners are critical to what we do. They strengthen our influence, particularly in terms of things like influencing the international rules-based order. So we discussed influencing the UN and norms of space behaviour, and they enhance our collective defence and deterrence as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So still a lot to talk about, and the questions have come in thick and fast. We do have some microphones around the room as well. And I'll first, though, go to a couple of Slido questions, but do raise your hand if you'd like to pose a question from the floor. Now, first question which has come through, could defence and government better leverage civil developments if civil space has longer-term budgets? What can the sector do to make a case for this? Doug, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Actually, yes, we struggle with the annualised budgets coming out the civil side. That there have been some improvements recently, and we hope that will continue. It does underpin a lot of the R&D work that's done on the civil side, and we do need to, I think, look at a national space program for civil applications now. We have a number of R&D things, but nothing operational. So we're very keen that that happens from the civil side of the world. Then obviously, as we say, and to Mark's point, yes, there is a challenge around dual use, and you have to do it by design. You don't build something and then go, oh, I could also use that over here. You start with that in mind. So we should start to look at, when we're developing some of these civil capabilities, absolutely building in the ability to manage the data securely, to do with things that we need to do to satisfy secure defence requirements. But absolutely, if there were better, longer term, more robust budgets that industry could plan against on the civil side, that would be a huge help.
Mark, what's your take on this?
So I think it's a really good point, because we're coming to the end of a funding cycle, and it depends on the election, but we may be looking at spending review of a year or 3 years, we don't know. But a 1-year horizon or a 3-year horizon isn't long enough for a lot of these space projects. But we're seeing in other sectors, so quantum and AI, that they are achieving these long-term strategies and these long-term funding pots from government. So other sectors are managing to have that conversation, but it's not quite landed yet in space. I think we still bump up against the problem that people don't fully understand space. They don't fully understand its enabling function for all these other technologies. There are examples where space is still regarded as risky. So the Mansion House pension funds announcement, for example, doesn't allow the pension funds to invest in space because space was not seen as mature enough. It flies completely against everything we understand, but we didn't manage to persuade them that that was the case. So there's still a perception, I think, that space is different, more risky, special, and people are not fully understanding that actually it's fundamental, it's a key enabling technology, and we do need to invest in the long term. So we've recognised the problem, we need to keep pushing the answer, and hopefully we'll get there. But I think it's a good point.
So is that a lack of communication between your departments and the Treasury?
There's definitely a bit of that, but we've got people in Treasury who are, they understand space very, very well. I think it's the problem that lots of different parts of government are making these decisions and they're not all up to speed. Because space is still relatively new. I mean, I know AI is relatively new, but space is still relatively new. So there's still a bit of a journey to go on in kind of terms of convincing people.
Okay, thank you. Another question's come through. Sophie Antrobus, Group Captain Keeley, painted a rich picture of space threats. Given this, why is the UK not accelerating its space domain awareness programme?
Great question. Thanks, Sophie. All right, so listening to what's been said before, particularly what Mark was saying about things like Space Sector Plan and about money, it's a fight for money and it's an educational challenge. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, different government departments have different budgetary cycles. So how do you align those for dual use capabilities? When it comes to fighting for money, we've got to put it in the context of wider defence. So this is a space audience. So of course, we're all interested in investment in space capabilities, but at the expense of what else? And then the educational challenge comes in that we've still got the challenge that we need to educate senior officials within all parts of defence, and not necessarily at the top level, actually within that middle area that have decision-making powers and financial delegations and decision authority over one capability versus another capability. Because of course, each of the single services frontline commands are going to come to the party and say, we need more of this in order to meet this defence objective, and the space community needs to do the same, but it needs to make sure that it gets its point across so that they understand the criticality of space, because as it is predominantly an enabler for other people's activities, sometimes it gets put a little bit down the priority list when it comes to funding investment.
Would you like to see a Minister for Space? Do you think that would make a difference?
Inside defence or
just generally? I mean, if there were to be a new government, how would you like space really to be recognised within government?
I think it goes back to what Mark was saying about the National Space Council. If we can give that National Space Council, or if it use the teeth that it's got, not give it teeth, use the teeth that it's got with that Secretary of State function, which then filters down in a coherent manner into all of their respective departments, I think that could be a very powerful tool.
Okay. And Josh, how do you think you could improve communication then? Because as Mark was pointing out, perhaps you haven't achieved all the goals that you were hoping to do.
So I think, given this panel is about how we work together on the space strategy, we do need to kind of acknowledge that the space strategy is only 2 years old. As I said, my department, Mark's department, didn't have a huge amount of dedicated resource 2 years ago. Now we do. The upcoming spending review, potentially change of administration through an upcoming election, those are opportunities for us to come together and communicate better to people like the Treasury, with our Secretary of State, that we didn't have 2-3 years ago. So we are in a different world to where we have been at any time in history, really, in how coordinated and collaborative we're already working together. So as we look to a spending review, as we prepare for an election, that is an opportunity for us to come together, work across our departments, work with industry and the academic sector as well, to cohere our narrative much better than we have ever done before. And we're already starting to do that. Like I said, I've already mentioned the Space Partnership, which is intended to bring together those different parts of the sector across government, including all three of the departments represented here and the Space Agency, the industry, academia, to cohere that narrative and put forward a case for space. I think the point that Dave was making about how space is an enabler is something that we as a sector have previously not been able to make that strong case yet. The fact that space now sits across so many departments means that we are able to access more levers, more policy areas that we can show and convince space has a place within those sectors, within those programs, within those forms of support, again, in a way that we have never been able to do historically. So we're already pretty well set up to do it. And there are functions being stood up now to prepare for the spending review across Whitehall to make sure that we are all thinking collaboratively, because, yeah, as we know, spending reviews can sometimes become a fight for departmental interests and individual budgets. But already, as a space community within Whitehall, we have said we're not going to do that. Yes, we will have to play the game within our departments, but under the National Space Council, under the National Space Board, at officials level, we are going to work together to coordinate all of our business cases to make sure that we are saying the same thing and we're referencing each other's objectives and drawing on each other's levers, so that as we put that case to the Treasury, to ministers, we are speaking with one voice and putting the case for space forward better than we have ever done before.
Okay, it's good to hear. Let's go to a question from the floor, if there's anybody with a hand up. Not yet. Well, I shall go to Slido again. So another question. The space strategy internally aligns government, but interfaces for industry are complex. How can government better join up and provide a brokered front door? I mean, you did allude to that, just now. But Josh, is there any other initiatives you think where it could be easier actually for private sector to be knocking on the right door, essentially?
So I think we do recognise that there is, as we've been saying, it's a great thing that more departments and more teams are working on space, but that does make the landscape a little bit more complex. There is recognition within government that is a challenge. For example, in the National Space Strategy in Action publication that came out earlier this year, there was a recognition that we do need to be better at aligning our messages that are coming out of different departments to industry, and for industry and the academic part of the sector to be able to come to government with the ability to access the right people in the government at the right time. It is the case that each department has its own remit, and so maybe we do need to be better at communicating exactly what each department is responsible for. For example, it's a little bit more straightforward for me in that any company that's looking to export is my responsibility. Any company that's looking to come to the UK, set up and expand in the UK, is my responsibility. And there was reference to that in the National Space Strategy itself, but that's 2 years old and departments have changed. So maybe we do need to be better at signposting, as you said earlier, to which department has responsibility for what. If there has been talk of kind of one single front door that sits across the entire government, I'm pretty sure that doesn't exist for any other sector. So that would be quite difficult, because it would just get caught in a system. There are lots of us working on space, which is a good thing, but we're all working on the bits that we should be working on. and we probably do need to be better at communicating which bits exactly each of us are working on.
Okay, great. Yes, go ahead, Mark.
So I think there are a couple of things to add to that as well. So the Space Partnership is an innovation. So the sector has come together with academia to act as a sounding board and a partner for government to work through some of the issues that we're trying to do. So that's a useful mechanism we've got as well. The other thing I think that I mentioned earlier is this lack of clarity, perhaps in the National Space Strategy, about what we're going to move on first. So the idea that we publish next month, February or March, the idea of a space sector plan, where we start to set out what our capability priorities are, that I think will also help, because one of the things the industry is asking for is a clearer sense of where we're going to move or what we're going to accelerate on. So that alignment should help the sector.
Okay,
But
thank you.
just to add,
Yeah.
I think from industry side, we also have the trade bodies with UK Space and ADS, who are, we kind of accept on the industrial side that government's always going to be complex. And as such, the trade bodies play a really valuable role in providing that mapping and providing that support to help people get to the right person or the right department.
Okay, thank you. Question from Chris McIntosh. Given the increase in dual-use systems and investment into space systems by other countries, how will the UK ensure that key capabilities remain under UK control? Dave, do you want to take that?
Yeah, but actually I'm going to defer back to Mark, because
Okay.
it refers to the Space Sector Plan.
Okay.
So part of the Space Sector Plan will be identifying what we call highly assured capabilities. So those where we want to keep them within our own national security environment, development in-house, and then deploy them as part of either defence, dual use, or wider government purposes. Mark, I don't think there's anything else you want to add on that.
I mean, the National Space Strategy in Action document already set out a number of areas where defence has decided that certain capabilities need to be highly assured. There are 4, so kind of those are already made clear. And then in addition, you also set out the priority technology areas where you want to be able to source from the UK specific technologies, and they're not all yet available in the UK, but then that helps departments steer R&D towards developing those capabilities, or if necessary, bringing in those capabilities to the UK. So it feels like we've gone quite far in understanding exactly what we need in terms of onshore capabilities.
Okay, thank you. So another question come through. Primes still act as the gatekeepers to MOD contracts. What is the MOD government doing to make sure that SMEs are given more opportunity to get a slice?
Is that back to me again, is it?
Well, perhaps you or Josh.
Well, I'll take a shot. So firstly, for example, UK Space Command has run a series of engagement events to do with capabilities that are within their portfolio. One of the other things is articulating cross-government requirements, so industry knows what the demand signal that's out there, so we can then bring them in. One of the hardest parts, though, for SMEs is sometimes we need to talk to them about the application of a new technology, which might be at a higher security classification. So I think there's a tension there. If the SME doesn't have the ability to handle secure information, how do we bring them in for a realistic conversation about how we might use their technology? And maybe some of that goes back to the gatekeeping point about the trade associations, or maybe the primes partnering with smaller SMEs, which I'm not sure is everyone's cup of tea. I'm looking at InSpace here who have done that, and whether there's advantages in doing that or not.
I think it's worked very well for us as a model. We have a big brother with BAE Systems who have supported us and given us the ability to access List X facilities and push our clearances through so that we're able to handle things. And that was always part of the deal with the engagement, but we'd already achieved clearances, etc., before we were required. And I think it goes back to my comment earlier about pulling up the ladders. We worked really hard to get all that stuff, and we got the reward was that we secured some contracts and we did a bunch of things. But actually, there are people out there with some excellent technologies who probably maybe don't know how to navigate the process the way we did, and don't recognise the reward at the end. So they're not willing to put the effort in now, or are just hitting a barrier. For whatever reason, there are a number of reasons they may not be going through that. And I think it's a loss to the sector that we haven't got some of those people and those technologies in. I think it works well with things like the DASA programme in terms of the R&D, and that is a great programme. And as an SME, we never secured one, but a lot of our colleagues did, and they were really powerful programmes. It's the next step after that, really, that's where it becomes operational, or you're doing an actually higher TRL activity, that are the things where the barriers are for SMEs.
Yeah, and I think it's easier for that engagement within the R&D/scientific community, as I say, before it reaches something that's more mature that you can roll out there.
Yeah. So yeah, rolling up the TRL is very important, and I think there's a role that industry can play there of working well and engaging with SMEs. And I know BAE do, I know Airbus and Lockheed, and a number of other primes that actually do go out there and run engagement sessions with the SMEs. I think it would be really good to then go back a year later and see what actually happened following those engagement sessions.
Yeah, but of course our interest is in early stuff as well. So we do have strategic investment funds that we can use for exactly those sorts of purposes, to catch the technology early in its development and then try and help it pull through into something that delivers a capability at the end.
I just wanted to expand on Doug's point around the role of primes. It is something that DCIT, the MOD and DBT are looking at through the Space Sector Plan, about how we work with companies of certain sizes, of strategic importance within the sector, and because there's a lot that industry and the academic sector ask of governments, we want to start putting some things back to industry on what the expectations of government are of big industrial players, so the primes. What are the expectations that we have of the primes if you want to operate in the UK, if you want a government contract, and if you want an MOD contract, if you want to access R&D funds? What are the expectations that we should be increasingly putting on the sector? And so we have already started some of these discussions with some of the companies that Doug mentioned around what are the expectations of the primes in terms of skills development, for example, as well as the amount of SME content that they have within their supply chain. And this fits into the narrative around supply chain resilience. If we've got primes that are here or that want to come here, they need to acknowledge their role in increasing the resilience within the supply chain and bringing SMEs into that supply chain in order to make the sector not only grow, but more resilient. And I think that is something that will be further expanded on in the Space Sector Plan. It is something that many of the companies in this room will already be aware of, that we are considering. But it is worth emphasising that through the National Space Strategy, the National Space Strategy in Action, Defence Space Strategy, the Space Sector Plan, government's thinking continues to evolve, and we are now at that stage where not only are we acknowledging what we need to do, but we also want to be much clearer in terms of what we want industry to do with us. And so that just those discussions that we're having with primes right now will be part of that move that we take to ensure that SMEs have those opportunities, more of those opportunities in future. And that's in addition to various frameworks and commitments that already exist across government, in government procurement. And we're also looking to best practice in other sectors. So SC21, Supply Chain 21, is a commitment in the aerospace sector that we are exploring how we can apply that framework that is focused on supply chain resilience, improving access of SMEs to primes, how we can apply that to the space sector.
Okay, thank you. We've got lots of questions coming through. We won't be able to get to all of them, so I'm going to focus on the most popular ones right now. And I think this is something, again, for Josh. You've spoken of the challenges and need for integrating innovative technologies. What proportion of awards have gone to the lowest cost bidder, however? I think that's very tough for him to say what proportion right now. But, you know, what would you say to that type of question? How do you make those assessments?
I was going to take a leaf out of a politician's book and say, I'll come back to you on that question. Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of how we increasingly use government procurement and government programs to support different objectives, whether it's defence requirements, growing the sector, making the sector more resilient, we are seeing an integration of our objectives across different programs more and more. As I said, my department and with support from BAEs at the time played a particularly key role in informing the certain Skynet decisions that resulted in order to achieve all of our collective objectives in a way that probably hadn't been done before. As we go forward, those through the Space Sector Plan, we are agreeing across governments, departments, and delivery organisations, agreeing how, for example, an exportability criteria can be factored into a programme or a procurement route. so that companies that can prove they have if they are given a contract or given an R&D grant, if they can prove that there is an exportable market that they can address by accessing this funding, that goes towards eventually goes towards their score and it determines how well they do in that program. Again, that's not the kind of thing that has been commonplace in space programs previously. That's just an example from my remit where I am extremely grateful to the UK Space Agency, to UK Space Command, MOD more broadly, DCIT, and others for taking on board the feedback that we provided, that actually we may not be supporting companies of the highest growth potential globally because it hasn't been part of the consideration. That's the kind of thing that working across Whitehall, we are able to do more to ensure that our different objectives come together in a collective way.
Okay, thank you. Good answer. So, Dave, this is a question for you. How will military balance transparent engagement with industry on future requirements versus security class of vulnerabilities without giving unfair competition advantage?
Sorry, read that again?
Yeah. So how will the military balance transparent engagement with industry on future requirements versus vulnerabilities without giving unfair advantage to the competition?
One thing I'd say on that is we've already started to publish clear cross-government requirements. So, for example, we recently released the cross-government SDA requirements, Space Domain Awareness requirements, and I'm sure more of those sorts of documents will fall out of the space sector plan once it gets finalised early next year. So that's the first thing is, what are those requirements? How do we get those pushed out? And then balancing transparency. Really, that comes down to what is the discussion about? Is it about a particular capability? Is it military only? Is it dual use? Who should be involved in that discussion? And it comes back to Josh's points about how do you balance primes versus SMEs versus security requirements. Doug's point about being on List X, in terms of being a List X company, having all of the security infrastructure in place. It is a challenge, but we've got to be clearer with that demand signal first before the conversation can start.
Okay, thank you. Question perhaps that you might be able to answer, Mark. What's the current UK government position on a national launch capability? And that's Dave. Both of you?
So we had the launch in January, successful launch from our perspective in the sense that all the regulations were in place. It wasn't easy to do it because it was the first launch from the UK soil, but the CAA did a brilliant job, the Space Agency did a brilliant job, and unfortunately I think kind of, Doug, one of your spacecraft was two of the spacecraft was some of the victims that are living merrily in the Atlantic. But from a regulatory government point of view, we've now proven that we can do it. We understand it. We've proven that we can operate launches from the UK. The next launches are towards the end of next year from Scotland. So it's an active programme. Phase 2 of the programme, where we're looking at understanding how we really stimulate the commercial market in the UK, is going ahead. We're working through the business case for that now. So it's still a government commitment. It's still a programme that's being delivered. It's still a capability that we want to have from the UK.
Okay, Doug, anything to add?
I think launch in the UK is really important. I think it's not just for the direct reason that somehow this makes a direct economic sense. I mean there are benefits in having it. I think it's what it creates around it, and we saw this in Cornwall over the period and the ramp up to the launch, the growth of an ecosystem in Cornwall. Now, unfortunately, it didn't sustain afterwards to the level that everyone hoped it would. And partly that was probably because of the launch operator and the troubles they got into, and the fact that they didn't really leave anything behind. But I think the idea of a sustainable launch capability in the UK is really powerful for embedding space into the UK and into our thinking, start to recognise it as something that we just do in the UK. And I think the cost of doing that are dwarfed probably by the benefits, because I think the benefits, not only to employment and the ecosystem, but also in a national, almost inspiration level and a less tangible level, are huge. And from my point of view, I love the idea of being able to put my satellite in the back of a van and drive down the road with it. So.
Okay, and Dave?
I don't know what road that is to get to some of these launch sites.
Yeah, I know,
that's for
right?
sure.
Well, we won't talk about Shetland.
No, launch is great in terms of not just obviously the ability to attract inward investment, but also from a national prestige perspective, because obviously there's a race going on. Norway say they're going to be the first. We don't know yet. Let's wait and see what happens. But it's one thing to consider is that UK launch as it stands with the planned spaceports and the capabilities isn't a panacea for every launch capability that you might want. So, for example, they can only go to LEO right now, and some of our future requirements, certainly in defence, will be beyond that. And so our policy in defence right now is just we need assured access to launch capabilities. We're not saying where those might come from. That will depend on the maturity of those launch capabilities and services that are available. But between now and 2039, we've only got the potential of maybe 10 satellites that we want to launch. So that's not a lot. So people often look to defence to say, oh, you could be an anchor client to kickstart UK launch ambition. Well, actually, we don't have that many things that we want to launch. So as those satellites start to mature, then we'll look at which launch services we need to procure.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's two questions come in that I'm going to combine. The first one is, do we need to brief the shadow government to ensure seamless space action through an election year? And also, with the possibility of a new government next year, do you think it's possible to ensure a consistent space strategy? So what's going on behind the scenes, Mark, in terms of trying to ensure that there is this consistency? Because, of course, we've had a pretty turbulent political scene over the past few years. How do you ensure that the capability remains and the vision remains intact?
I mean, there are tried and tested processes. When an election is called, government moves into a phase of ensuring a smooth transition to the next administration, whatever it might be. So there's a tried and tested mechanism where seniors engage with all of the parties to understand what their manifestos mean, how government might deliver them, how you prep them, because the last thing you want is a government coming in and you needing to scratch your head for 6 weeks about what does it mean and what do you really want. So that will happen. It will cover space as it will cover other things, but it all relies on an election being called. We've got no sense when the election would be. I think there's a role for the industry side. Industry has access to politicians as well. So if the industry side is also kind of engaging with all of the different parties ahead of a possible election, that would make sense as well. I mean, you're deputy head of UK Space. I don't know if you want to say...
Yeah, I shouldn't be wearing that VC hat today, but yes, I am. And UK Space ADS will continue to engage with the shadow cabinet as well as, the cabinet direct. So the preparatory work is in train.
Okay, thank you, Juliana. Anything to add?
Yeah, just kind of touching on to the point that I made earlier about sort of Chinese consistent thinking on space, which obviously isn't hindered by things like government changes. So sorry. So there's obviously bigger structural things at play, but I think something that is key for us to do, and I'm talking sort of us in this room, is to consistently communicate the importance of space. And I think it's a point that Dave made earlier about, space being primarily used as an enabler, which is why it sometimes gets lost on the priority list. But I think we do need to make the case that, yes, space is primarily used as an enabler for defense especially, but without that digital backbone, you're losing out on a lot of capabilities. And I think that sometimes gets lost in sort of bigger political discussions. So I think if we consistently communicate that point, then hopefully we can see consistency in seeing space as a priority as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question has come through, very popular. When will we prioritise the fostering of UK talent and company growth over foreign companies setting up shell offices and being seen as an equal for UK capabilities? Pulling no punches here. Who would like to take that one?
Gladly, I can say it's not me this time, which is great.
I can talk wearing a small part of my UK space hat, which is to say that we do see a number of companies being incredibly grumpy that large companies are being encouraged over, who aren't filling necessarily a capability gap in the UK, but in some cases are replacing indigenous capabilities, and that's always a concern. And I think we need to get better control over that, because all that happens is they land, they steal all the people from the nearby companies and torpedo a lot of growth that we've actually been supporting. So it's a left-hand, right-hand thing, right? So having a clearer vision as to which companies we want to attract to land, and then conditions around them landing, which aren't all about here, have some geo return from ESA, or please access our new defence programme, but also, and if you do this, you set up, you invest in training of new people. You invest in infrastructure that can be shared by other companies. Messaging like that, I think it's important that we're not so desperate tripping over ourselves to get big names to land here that we sort of screw up what we've already got.
Josh, how are you approaching these concerns?
So it is the case that in our foreign direct investment approach, we try as hard as we can to integrate new entrants to the market in the right places, whether that's in terms of capability or geographically, in order to make sure they don't massively disrupt the supply chain, that they don't massively disrupt the workforce and the accessibility of talent in the areas that they land. Now, that's not to say that, for example, my department and my team support every single company that comes into the UK. We can't and we don't. So the ones that we do, we try to think strategically about where they go into the supply chain, where they go into, which cluster they join, for example. Going forwards, we've already referenced that as part of the space sector plan, we will be changing our approach even further so that when we're particularly looking at bigger companies coming into the UK, there will be those expectations that we set on them from the outset. And there are companies that we've already done that with that are starting to do it, which is really welcome, but we need to do it better and be even more strategic about it going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Juliana, you mentioned earlier that even though obviously China, the way that policy is pursued in terms of space, no change of administration, yet on the other hand, the fact that we don't have a flourishing private sector involvement, how does that kind of balance out effectively?
That's a good question. I think in the case of China, it's sort of government-led, sort of what priority is sort of led. And I know that there's specifically when it comes to space companies and them seeking out sort of a place to actually build their business, it's often the municipalities who sort of give them financial incentives to actually settle down. So there is still that sort of top-down, I would argue, sort of control or at least influence into who gets to flourish. And obviously in the case of Guowang, what we're seeing now is these companies sort of being put together to then build what the government sees as a priority. At least that's what we can sort of tell, obviously from the outside looking in. But having seen the way that the companies are being sort of put together to build this constellation and sort of their original plans being changed, that's at least what we can tell.
Okay, thank you. Now we've just got time for one more question, so I am again going to go for the most popular. If UK Space Command is supposed to be the protect and defensive arm of the nation, why is the government not providing a separate funding line rather than being dependent on air?
That's actually a misnomer. So it's allocated space funding, which is managed by the air top level budget. That's an easy one.
Okay. Lovely. Well, we might have time for one more then.
Sorry. And I'm sure my Space Command colleagues would stand up and correct me if that's not right. But yeah.
So what lessons have been drawn from the Russia-Ukraine war and how has this shaped thinking on space strategy? I mean, we did allude to it a little earlier, but is there anything else that you would like to add?
Only that within the Ministry of Defence, we're kind of not necessarily reorganising, but we're putting more focus on a campaigning approach. And so from our perspective, what we've done is made sure that any lessons that we're learning are re-injected back into our strategic planning and campaigning processes so that we obviously don't make any mistakes moving forward and making sure that we understand how our potential adversaries are using space in a way that could undermine our strategic advantage.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, lots more questions we didn't get to. We will, of course, have lots more opportunity in the later panels to put some of those questions. So what I would do is if your question wasn't asked, put it in your back pocket because we have overlapping themes and also we'll be coming together for kind of a wrap-up panel session later. So that's another opportunity to pose some questions. But thank you very much for all of the interaction. And I'd really like to thank the panel, Doug, Dave, Josh, Juliana, and Mark. It is time for coffee. Please do, though, be back promptly because we've got lots more to discuss. But I'd like to thank the panel very much, but don't go anywhere because we're having a photo.
All right.
Thank you.